Can I suggest all the questions will be at the end of all the speaker? Okay. Thank you. David, please.
Thank you, Mandy. Well, I've been asked to spend 10 minutes talking on the CESR in trauma and orthopaedic surgery tips and tricks. It's a bit of a tall order in 10 minutes, so I'll cover some basics, but obviously we'll have time for questions at the end. So we're just going to look at the essentials of the process, how the application is assessed, common stumbling blocks, and summarise that with the tips at the end. The reason I was asked to do this was that I spent probably 7 years on what was originally Article 14 panel when I was on the SAC, and continued for a couple of years afterwards on the CESR panel, although I haven't been involved in assessing CESR applications for about 18 months now. So what is CESR? Well, it's time-consuming and expensive. That's what it is. And part of the reason for that is that Health Education England, via various agencies, assesses approximately how many consultants it needs, and it provides funding for training schemes to produce that number of consultants. That's a lot of funding it produces. It doesn't produce funding to produce consultants via other routes, and so that's where that money goes that people end up spending on the CESR process, because Health Education England are not paying it. It's a route for entry onto the specialist register. I apologise if I'm telling you what you already know. I'll be brief with this. For those who have not completed an approved training programme, and it enables practice as a substantive consultant. So one thing you've got to ask yourself is that what I want at the end of the day? So the clinics list, the bits you enjoy working will stay the same. Do you want the other stuff that comes with being a consultant? So you need to look at that and think hard about that as well. But what you've got to do is to show that your training and achievements over the length of a training cycle are equivalent, and that's probably the biggest stumbling block, is that what's going to be assessed by the GMC is what you've done to prepare yourself over a similar time course to a training programme, so that at the point that you're awarded the eligibility for registration, you are the same as somebody who's come through a training programme. And that's the bit that's quite difficult to achieve without the programme director and without the training committees behind you, pushing you along. Historically, this is what's on the GMC website, just for numbers and for success rates. The numbers have been declining. I don't know what's happened in the last year or two, but the numbers applying for CESR registration has declined. It has been about a 50% success rate. I don't know what happened in 2013. It's small numbers. You can't take anything from that statistically. But it's about a 1 in 2 success rate of the people applying over the past few years. The submission, what you've got to prepare for the GMC, and I'm sure you've already looked on the GMC website, you've downloaded the form that you've got to fill in, but that form doesn't have the evidence that you've got to produce. You're looking at about 1,000 pages of evidence. Just about every single page that you produce will have to have a signature on it, because the trainees have to get things validated as they go along by their educational supervisors and trainers and program directors, and if you're not in a training program, you don't get that, but the GMC will still want to see validation of everything that's happened. And it has to cover the 4 domains of good medical practice. Most of the evidence that you will be producing will be in the fields of knowledge, skills and performance, so that is your validated logbooks, the educational things that you've attended, the assessments of your operative skill across the curriculum. So, equivalent to what then? You're being told that you've got to produce all this validated evidence. Just have a little sidestep and look at what the GMC expect of the trainees who are going to be awarded a CCT. Well, they expect them to have done 6 years of training in trauma and orthopaedics, covering all aspects of the curriculum, and you can download that curriculum that easy. There's a lot in there. On the clinical side, and this is a very brief overview of the needs, they will need to have done about 1,800 cases in their logbook, so that's about 300 cases a year. There are now minimum numbers across a range of procedures. So for instance, you will need to have done 30 IM nails, 40 knee replacements, 40 hip replacements, 40 hemiarthroplasties, 40 hip fracture fixations, 40 ankle fractures, etc. But it's not just getting the numbers, you've got to have shown progression, so you've got to have been assessed doing these. And trainees are assessed with procedure-based assessments. There are other assessments, DOPS, mini-CACs, etc., which you actually may soon, or perhaps already. I'm a little bit behind here because ISCP version 10, which is what the trainees use for as their electronic portfolio, as it were, is going to be made available to SAS doctors. I was told that at an education meeting at the college in the spring. I was told it was going to happen around about the autumn, but it is coming to the time where you will be able to register and have access to those tools electronically. But even if you don't, you have access to paper-based versions that have been around that you can download, print and use and present to people to get them to assess you in doing these procedures. Academically, and this can be a stumbling block for trainees as well, over the 6 years before the point of award of certification, they've got to have done 2 peer-reviewed papers and had them published. Not submitted for publication, but published and findable on PubMed, Medline, etc. There is an alternative to that in the standards for training, but that's quite a stiff one. The trainee can have work in progress being lined up for publication, but they also have to have recruited 5 patients to national trials, attended a GCP course for research, done 2 podium presentations and evidence of critical analysis of the literature. So essentially that's for people in academic training schemes who are working on big projects that are going to take a long time to publish. Additionally, the other bits you've not got to forget about, but if you don't think about them as you're going along, you can't do them in retrospect. So a trainee has got to have been involved in at least 1 audit per year, and 2 of those have got to be taken through a full audit cycle. They've got to have shown evidence of involvement in education and training, which you have to for a CESR 2, which means attending a course such as training the trainers or equivalent, and give evidence in your portfolio of having given at least 1 lecture a year on an organised teaching programme with written feedback. So it's not just, I did this lecture. And you have to have been involved in a management course. I would say that I was reading this and thinking, gosh, that's changed since I was doing that only 2 or 3 years ago. The goalposts are moving. But it just reminded me that when I'm with my trainee, they keep telling me the goalposts are moving. And when they started on the programme, they didn't have to do this, that or the other. But now they've got to do it, and they've only got 1 year left. How am I going to do that? So I'm afraid the needs are changing for everyone as we go along. And they have to have attended, ATLS is a good example. When I was on the SOC, it was decreed that as from 6 months from now, everybody who's awarded a CCT has to have a valid current ATLS certificate. Well, there were lots of trainees whose ATLS certification had expired, and it was a year waiting list for a course. So they couldn't get on it to get their CCT. It happened. So that happens all the way along with regular assessments, with PVAs, procedures, etc. And then at the end, they have to, or not at the end of 4 years, they have to prepare for the FRCS trauma and orthopaedics as a test of knowledge. And then before the certification is awarded, the JCST looks at the sequence of readers, the final reader and the sign-off from the program director. So that's the evidence that the trainee has to collect, and the equivalence route means you have to collect the equivalent evidence, and that's why it's such a big task with 1,000 pages of evidence. The GMC, though, that awards the certification, not the colleges or the JCT, but the GMC does take advice from the JCST, as it is, the Joint Committee on Surgical Training, on who certification should be awarded to. So that's where the Article 14 now CESR panels come in, and there'll be a minimum of 2 people, usually people who are on the SSE, so are regularly involved in assessing trainees, who will also assess the CESR applications that are sent to them by the colleges and make the recommendation. That they take 2, and they're done independently. If you're doing one of these, you're not allowed to talk to the person somewhere else in the country who's doing the same one. And then the college collates them, looks at them, and if they are saying the same thing, they make the recommendation based on that to the GMC. And as I say, it's the GMC that awards the certification, not the colleges. So, stumbling blocks, well, just all that evidence, just all those 6 years worth of validated operation notes, logbooks and everything, properly anonymised. We don't want patient names, telephone numbers, addresses, things like that in the application. Just as in my appraisal documentation, I am not allowed to put that sort of detail, and it's an offence if I do. It's the breadth of training in 6-year period. It's getting that experience that a training program director will make a trainee go to spinal surgery, to hand surgery, to children's surgery, that is very difficult to do if you're not on a training program. And getting research, getting 2 publications in 6 years can be quite difficult. I've seen consultants whose CV has 2 papers on it that they got in the year before they were appointed. And evidence of audit, again, if you've not done it, then you can't make it up. If you have done it but not documented it, then you've not done it. So get that evidence and collect it as you go on. And the exam, it's not the FRCS TNO that is essential for the CESR, but it's almost essential because if you don't have it, you have to prove that you've got something equivalent. And research isn't equivalent to an exam. You can't say I've got a higher degree, so that's the same as doing the exam, because the trainees separately have to have evidence of research and the exam, so the equivalence will be the same. So, in the evidence, the stumbling blocks are getting all those signatures. Is the evidence equivalent, and is there enough across all aspects of the curriculum? And so the tip would be, get everything signed as you go along. Use the documents that trainees use where possible, and that should be becoming easier. And make sure at the outset, when you think you're going to go down this pathway, you get on the JCST website, you get on the GMC website, you download the gold guide for trainees, and you make sure that everything you do is aiming for equivalence. The breadth of training, the trainees have to include all aspects of the curriculum. So children's spines and hands are the hardest bits for trainees to get. And they have to, the guide for trainees suggests 3 lists including a trauma list and 2 clinics including a fracture clinic every week for the 6 years. So if you're thinking of going down the CESR pathway, don't rely on historical experience. If you did another training program 10 years ago and now you've decided in another country that wasn't the JCST program, or even if you had registrar jobs in this country 10 years ago, they don't really count. The GMC is not interested in what you did 10 years ago unless you can prove that you have kept everything you learned right bang up to date at the moment that you went onto the program. So it's what's happened in the last 6 years that's going to be the most important. And research, as I've said, it's a stumbling block for trainees. Higher degrees are no substitute if you haven't got a publication. It's the research publications that count, not the MSc or whatever, if no publications came out of that. So So get the research done before starting your application, and don't forget audits. Audits and research are different. There are targets for each in trainees, as there are for people coming on the CESR pathway. And finally, the exam. Now, I know quite a bit about this as well, because I'm an examiner assessor, and I sit on the intercollegiate board, so I get to see all the data on this. And the pass rate for those on programs is much higher than for those who are not on programs. But the examiners who are examining you do not know who you are, whether you're a trainee or anything. The problem for people who are not on programs is that the exam tests what the programs deliver. And if you haven't had that delivered to you, if you've had to try and acquire it yourself, it's not going to be as efficiently put in there as if it is delivered to you. So that's the problem with the exam. It's harder because you haven't been coached into it and prepared for it. So to summarise, for the tips, I'd say use the GMC and JCC websites. Start planning 6 years in advance if you can. It is an awful... I've met people, in fact I've met somebody who was working as a consultant in this country, but at the time when the register was compiled, he was working in another country. He came back to this country, hadn't realised that he'd missed the opportunity to get onto the specialist register. So even though he'd been a substantive consultant, he wasn't on the specialist register, and he had to go through the CESR pathway to get this done. And I can tell you, it was a nightmare for him, a lot of hours of work. So planning in advance if you can. Electronic logbook or portfolio is ideal. The college provides, if you're a college member and not if you can't get access to the ISCP, which you may be able to in the future, the college has electronic portfolios that you can use, the colleges. And don't rely on what you did more than 6 years ago, I'm afraid. Trainees who come in having done jobs a few years ago and gone into something else and come back, that experience doesn't count for them towards their CCT. And no research, no CESR. Get the FRCS TNO. There's just about nothing equivalent in the country. So I've assessed applications that have been successful for people who haven't had the FRCS TNO. Those are very few and far between. There isn't another exam in the world that is as reliable and as rigorous as that one. So it's very hard to prove equivalence. So thank you very much.